Hi everyone and good evening. Welcome to our discussion today on the very critical topic of rethinking dialogue in the new age of challenges and opportunities. The past 2 decades and perhaps the past few months even more so have had a big impact on the way we live our lives, our politics, our religions, and the society we live in as a whole. In the face of this, we're seeing a rise in populism, in nationalism, and very xenophobic and divisive conspiracy theories. Many of these have brought into the reality how we are to live as a cohesive society together. In the sphere of dialogue, in both our personal, political, and civilizational levels of life, we see that the need is greater than ever. But what are the potential new challenges, and are there opportunities within these challenges themselves? Are we looking at a new age of challenges and a new age of opportunities? We're fortunate today to have Professor Paul Weller with us discussing this theme specifically. Professor Paul Weller is a part-time professor at the Coventry at the Centre for Trust and Peace and Social Relations at Coventry University, and in the Social, Cultural and Legal Research Centre at the University of Derby, and the Research Fellow in the Religion and Society at Regent's Park College, Oxford. So without further ado, I'd like to pass the mic on to Professor to continue with his presentation, and then we'll be fortunate to have a discussion. So if you are watching live, please do feel free to add your questions or comments into the chat section, the live chat section, and we can integrate them into the presentation and perhaps at the end too. So thank you very much. Professor Paul Weller, the slide is now yours.
United Kingdom, or whatever time in the day it is, wherever you are in the world, because this is one of the great things about electronic connections and communications, that it's possible to have that across different timelines and geographies. So thank you for joining this evening. I'm only going to try and give something of an overview of this title and some key thoughts that at least are stimulated for me by addressing the title, Rethinking Dialogue in the Age of New Challenges and Opportunities. And my aim is not to try to make a definitive statement about this, but rather actually to open up that discussion with those of you online. And later in the autumn, the Dialogue Society, who are sponsoring this, will be having a key seminar around aspects of this also in the UK. So it's partly preliminary to that. It's an opportunity for you online to join in this discussion. Hopefully, maybe stimulated by some of the thoughts that I'd like to share with you in a headline kind of way. So, first of all, you will, and many of us will have been experiencing in recent days, the thought post-COVID-19 or in the middle of COVID-19 that, quotes unquote, things will never be the same again. For those of us who've been around for at least 20 years in our lives, that has a kind of an echo. And the echo that it has is back to September 11, 2001. That's to say the attack on the Twin Towers and the Pentagon in the USA by suicide bombers, by the planes that were driven or flown into the Twin Towers. And very much after that event, the reflection of many people was things will never be the same again. Now, in some kind of sense, when we look back on that, we think, well, how far is that true? It was said then, it's now being said again 20 years on. With COVID-19, will things return to some kind of normality or new normality once time moves on? Did that happen post September 11, 9/11? Well, I think that in many significant ways, September 11 did mark a break in time, one of those kind of breaks that occur from time to time, in the sense that it brought us face to face with a new world reality. It was very soon after the ending of the Cold War, which had configured the world in basically two power blocks, and everybody thinking about the world, acting within the world, was very much caught up in that paradigm. When the Berlin Wall came down and the former Soviet Union dissolved, it was like a new opening in many ways, but then came 9/11, and it reconfigured, in a sense, the old ideas of enemy and enemy image that was challenging to people of different backgrounds from the previous communist and capitalist division of the world into two spheres. And it brought about, in many ways, a sharp division, not justly, but a sharp division between those who saw themselves as part of, quotes unquote, the Western world, and very often in popular thinking and reaction, an identification of Muslims or Islam as generically being the enemy of that Western world, as symbolized through the events of 9/11. So it reconfigured the divisions of the world from political divisions of left and right into the kind of civilizational divisions that were reflected in the thinking and writing at the time of Samuel Huntington and the notions of a clash of civilizations. And this effected, in many ways, therefore, a paradigm shift, which, to the challenges of dialogue, brought new questions and issues. It brought new questions and issues to interreligious dialogue. Was it possible to go around or to ignore events of that kind as part of the substance of dialogue between people of different faiths? It brought challenges to political dialogue, whereas previously, when conflicts within the world had broken out, there had been channels of interstate diplomacy. The breakthrough of 9/11 was a rude awakening to the fact that conflicts were no longer contained or containable within interstate relations and the diplomatic relations and channels, which had at some level been an expression of dialogical engagement between people and states and governments on different sides of the ideological and political divide. How would it be possible? Could it be possible? Would it be possible at all to engage dialogically in this kind of new environment when there were not, so to speak, political demands, or at least apparently not political demands, to engage with and to respond to? Can one engage in the mode of dialogue at all with those who bring terror, and terror in particular in the name of religion? So these are not easy or straightforward questions. They were severe and important challenges to dialogue on multiple levels, religious, political, and personal, for many people, arising from the events of 9/11. When reflecting on those events myself a little bit later on, and also connecting them with the kind of debates that went on also globally, involving in some senses also Islam and inter-civilizational conflict, or so it appeared, around the so-called Satanic Verses controversy and Salman Rushdie, which had been a little bit earlier, but then carried on past this date. A few years later, I wrote a book on the Rushdie affair, and then reflected backwards on both that and 9/11 in terms of the kind of challenges that these brought and the questions that came out of that, I'd now like to share with you. So if I can move on next slide, please. That's just the cover from the book where I had 6 points of challenge. And these were my points of challenge. Number one, governments must learn from history that to combat terror with methods that undermine human rights will only strengthen those forces that use terror as a means of advancing their cause. And in the era of post 9/11, it wasn't only the actions of 9/11, but it was also the responses that followed that, both in terms of domestic security and terror policies and practices, and also globally and internationally in terms of what happened with the invasion of Iraq and other international developments. And therefore, to me, part of the dialogical challenge, part of the learning challenge, is a challenge for governments to learn from history that to combat terror with methods undermining rights will only strengthen those forces that use terror as a means of advancing their cause. Next slide, please. To ignore or deny the reasons that those who use terror to advance their cause give for their actions is unlikely to lead to the resolution of the problems caused by terror. Very often in the debates, the public debates around post 9/11 or around the Satanic Verses controversy, the motivations of those who engaged in terror were to some extent brushed on one side. And people who engaged in terror were either portrayed as being mad or crazy people. And the reasons that they themselves gave were not engaged with. I think largely out of a concern not apparently to justify or give justification to those reasons by listening to them or taking them seriously. And that, of course, was the concern, that it might to mix up, in my view, justification and clear understanding of what might lie behind something. Understanding what might lie behind something doesn't actually mean to support it, but it's actually critical to engaging it and overcoming it. Okay, next slide, please. As mentioned at the beginning, 9/11 brought in particular, in a sense, religion back onto the international stage, from which in many ways it had been absent in the name of secularization in the previous decades. And of course, terror that's undertaken in the name of religion. And here one can remember also not only these events, but also terror that was undertaken in the name of religion or religio-cultural things in what happened in the southeast of Europe, not in the name of Islam, but in the name of the Christian tradition, and from which also then Muslims in southeast Europe suffered in things such as Srebrenica and so on. Terror in the name of religion is particularly dangerous, both to the wider body politic and to religions themselves, because it harnesses ultimate convictions and commitments in its destructive service. Terror is not new, armed or violent terror, but historically, it's often been aligned in the 20th or late 19th and early 20th centuries more with political and national aims. But its alliance with, on the part of those who use it in the name of religion, has a particular power and danger linked to it because of this connection with ultimate convictions and commitments. And that makes it different and more problematic to engage with in many ways than terror in the name of advancing a national cause. Next slide. One of the responses that certainly happened in the United Kingdom to 9/11, and then what happened subsequently in terms of the terror events that occurred in London, in bombings in the London Underground and London transport system, was that the government wanted to try to reach out legitimately and understandably to the wider Muslim community in order to both make that distinction between those who use the name of Islam in order to carry out acts of terror and the wider Muslim community who did not support those mechanisms or those actions of terror in the name of Islam and wished to distance themselves from that. But one of the ways in which the government perhaps went about that was, as put here, attempts by the powers that be artificially and externally to try to create a kind of liberal or moderate Islam, or indeed this would apply to any other religion. They're likely to prove ineffective and may also backfire, because if governments try to engage with wider religious groups by creating and supporting artificially a different version of a religion, then that is unlikely to find acceptance within the broad tradition, and it is likely to be seen as trying to impose something externally, rather than using the resources of the tradition itself to challenge those actions that need to be challenged. Okay, next point. Point 5. Within this whole post-9/11 environment and the challenges for dialogue and opportunities presented by it, Muslims and indeed people of other religions or beliefs indeed, I'm arguing, have to accept a greater responsibility for combating the dissemination and propagation of enemy images among the faithful. So this is not to blame wider faith communities, but it is to say and to recognize that there is a responsibility within each tradition, precisely because of the dangers that are amplified when religion and terror become connected with each other, precisely because of that ultimate view of religion, that traditions themselves have that responsibility for overcoming this enemy image of whatever the enemy is. If the enemy is seen as being Western civilization, or the enemy is seen by some as being Islamic civilization, the responsibility is for challenging those enemy images in the same way that many people accepted the responsibility to challenge enemy images between the capitalist world and the communist world during that binary division of the world in the Cold War. And then the final point of the 6-point challenge. For what I've called here, or at least in the book from which these 6 points are taken, multiculturalism, but at the moment one can debate what that means and one can argue with it as a term, but fundamentally, if one's talking about being able to live in some way or another with plurality in the world, for this possibility to have a future, arguing that governments and societies must acknowledge and tackle Islamophobia and indeed all other forms of discrimination and hatred on the grounds of religion or belief. So this is not only a challenge in terms of religious forms of discrimination and hatred experienced by Muslims, or in different parts of the world also by Christians or people of other religious traditions, but also sometimes that which is experienced by those of no religion or belief. Indeed, recently the European humanists brought out a report on the global situation of people who are, from a humanist or atheist perspective, facing severe discrimination, sometimes persecution, and sometimes violence because of their atheism or humanism. So we'll conclude those 6-point challenges. Maybe they just help to focus a few things around which we can consider the challenges to dialogue arising from 9/11. And in some senses, they slide into the second set of challenges to dialogue, which I've identified for this talk and discussion. That is the challenges that are associated with the rebirth of nationalisms and of populisms. Now, certainly in the European context in which I live, the 19th century was in many ways the century of nationalisms. The emergence of different nation states as we know them today was not there, or the history was of more of empires of one kind or another, often multi-ethnic or multinational empires. But with the passage of the 19th century, 1848 onwards, nationalisms arose, and the map, certainly of Europe as we know it today, in many ways started to be formed. Then nationalisms, of course, in some senses re-emerged in connection particularly with versions of fascism and of Nazism in the 20th century, extreme forms of right-wing nationalism. While on the whole, probably it's the case that politically speaking, the left wing tried to emphasize internationalism. Populisms, also as a phrase that we come across a lot today, is always in our media. The idea of populism as drawing upon the force and the movement of people, of appealing to things that people in general, or speaking in the name of the people. One can find that in lots of different political contexts. In the Europe that we have today, one can look at a number of different countries. We've had the rise in a country such as France, originally of what was called the Front National, now recalled Rassemblement National or National Rally. In Hungary, we can look to the role and the approach very often of Viktor Orban's Fidesz party, and the way in which that mobilizes, on the one hand, nationalism, on the other hand, populism, and often very strongly connected with cultural and religious themes. The sense of anxiety about the purity of the nation, the sense of it being under threat, the sense of wanting to defend, even in terms of the ideals of the European Union. One must recognize that although the European Union was founded and built in order to try, in a sense, to overcome historical nationalisms and the wars that had led to in Europe, when one considers what can be called fortress Europe, the way in which Europe has often closed its doors, for example, to the thousands of asylum seekers and refugees who have often been dealt with in ways contrary to the articulated values of the European Union. So, for example, in 2018, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees estimated 2,275 deaths in the Mediterranean, which was one death for every 51 arrivals. And that in itself, the notion of fortress Europe, is something which, not on a national level, but on a kind of European identity level, can echo some of the kind of protectionisms that the rebirth of modern nationalisms and populisms have been concerned to try and bring about. And where this becomes particularly difficult, dangerous and challenging is in relation to religion and belief. So I'd like to share with you now a slide which comes out of reflection, in fact, on the conflicts over many years on the island of Ireland, and it's called a scale of othering and of sectarian and communalist danger. And it goes like this. One can start very mildly and in a way that's quite reasonable. We are different. We behave differently. We are right. We are right, and you are wrong. You are a less adequate version of what we are. You are not what you say you are. We are, in fact, what you say you are. What you are doing is evil. You are so wrong that you forfeit ordinary rights. You are less than human. You are evil. You are demonic. So here one can see how something that begins in one particular way doesn't have to end like it does on this scale, but how it's possible to move from one aspect of this scale to another aspect. If this chain of transmission, if this thing is not challenged and broken by engagement, certainly in terms of dialoguing with those who are otherwise othered in these kinds of ways, and particularly around religion and belief. Many people say, well, you have to keep this out of public life, and that's the way in order to overcome these kind of scales of danger that can emerge. But I'd like to share with you now a slide with a reflection written out of the context of India, reflecting on the relationships between religion, politics, the secular, and dialogue. And it comes from a political scientist in India. So to say that politics and religion should be kept separate is understandable, especially at a time like ours. But what it should really mean is that politicians should not use religions for short-term political ends, and religious leaders should not use politicians for narrowly communal gains. Surely every religion, though, has a public and social and public dimension. To say that religion should be a private affair is to misunderstand both religion and politics. And now on to the third thing as a point of reflection around the new challenges and potential opportunities for dialogue, namely the period through which we have all been living in terms of the global pandemic. Challenges to dialogue arising in and through COVID-19. In many ways, COVID-19 has, I guess, thrown the world together, while also accentuating some of the divisions that exist within the world. So as drugs start to be discovered, who gets to buy them and to use them and who doesn't, to refer to something relating to the news today about the drugs that actually can help at least hinder the use of the disease, and the very high percentage of them that are being purchased by the United States. COVID-19 also brings about other kinds of challenges in the sense of whenever our world goes out of control from what our expectations of normality have been, when the unexpected happens and things are no longer there in a way that we think we can rely on and that we've come to expect and build our lives around, there is always the danger of looking for the scapegoat. Where does this come from? What mysterious forces lie behind this? What is moving the world? And so, off the back of COVID-19, one of the things that has been seen, for example, has been a rise also in anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic tropes that have emerged as historically in the Cold War, Jews were blamed both for capitalism and for communism. Somehow Jews become also responsible for and behind the emergence and development of COVID-19. Other people of a religious background, sometimes they're interpreting COVID-19 in terms of their understanding of the last days, and occasionally also aligning themselves with a kind of science skepticism about treating and engaging with COVID-19 on the basis of it being a biological and an illness threat to us all, but putting it within some other kind of framework that then raises other deep questions of the relationships between people of different backgrounds. COVID-19 has sometimes also thrown up other things, other possibilities, good and new possibilities. So sometimes among people of different faiths, and the Dialogue Society that's sponsoring this event has itself been involved in that, opening up possibilities online for people of different backgrounds to interact, perhaps for the first time, out of their common shared humanity in facing some of the dangers that come to our everyday human existence, and sharing, sometimes in terms of prayer and spirituality, and those new opportunities to share on a human level in relation to a common threat, which is not to be identified with individuals or with groups, but with something that has shaken the foundations of many of our lives and has impacted disproportionately on people. So I know, for example, in the United Kingdom, Black and minority ethnic people have been disproportionately affected by COVID-19. So I know somebody on the one hand of a Bengali background living in London who's lost 5 very good friends. And on the other hand, I know somebody from an African Caribbean background in Birmingham who's also lost 5 members of their church congregation. One is Muslim, the other is Christian, both out of their common experience in terms of Black and minority ethnic position within society, are sharing in this disproportionate effect of COVID-19, which we don't fully understand properly yet scientifically or socially, but certainly is manifesting itself in ways that are of disadvantage to people of Black and minority ethnic background. And it's in that context as well that the final challenge and opportunity around dialogue that I've identified for discussion and reflection, we'll now have up, please, on the slide, has occurred, which is, of course, the emergence from the death of George Floyd. Well, not only that, because the Black Lives Matter in the USA was there long before that, but has been focused in a global sense, and with all the kind of challenges that have emerged out of that for societies in different parts of the world. Here in the United Kingdom, the debates that have occurred around, for example, the rightness or otherwise of pulling down memorial statues to those who've been involved in the slave trade. But very significantly also, what does it mean in terms of violence and the experience of violence at the hands of authority of people of Black and minority ethnic background? What does it mean for equality of opportunity? And when there is something that's very challenging like this, how does one engage in dialogue? Is challenge something that is separate from dialogue, or should it be part of dialogue? Because sometimes dialogue is presented as being a very sugary kind of activity that people undertake only when they think they have lots of things in common. But what about dialogue when there is a sharp challenge? And I want to read to you something that was written a good 20 years ago now, that relates to this Black Lives Matter challenge, that was actually written by Salman Rushdie in a pamphlet called The New Empire Within Britain. And he wrote this. He said, "You talk about the race problem, the immigration problem, all sorts of problems. If you are a liberal, you say that black people have problems. If you are not, you say that they are the problem. But the members of the new colony have only one real problem. The problem is white people. Racism, of course, is not our problem. It is yours. We simply suffer the effects of your problem. Until you, the whites, see that the issue isn't integration or harmony or multiculturalism or immigration, but simply the business of facing up to and eradicating the prejudices within almost all of you, then the citizens of your new and last empire will be obliged to struggle against you." They're sharp words. They're words of deep challenge. They're words which might make some people angry, might make some people defensive, might make some people want to argue and emphasize more common humanity. But they're words that I think we need to take seriously in this time, the time of COVID, the time of Black Lives Matter, the time post 9/11, the time of the rise in nationalisms and populisms. And if dialogue is to mean anything in terms of substance and in terms of engagement with real life, and to have the possibility of making positive contributions, then dialogue cannot skirt around these things. Dialogue needs to engage with these things. And in doing so, it might find that new opportunities open up. Thank you. We'll stop there, I think, now, so that we can open up to wider discussion.
I'll try and get our question. So thank you very much, Professor, for the very informative discussion and kick-starting the discussion. We've got a couple questions, and I'm sure we'll have some more coming through. But just to start off with the first one, was not the Blair-Bush War on Terror a challenge to dialogue? Is our first question. I'm not
yes, absolutely it was. And I think of course, one of the things that happened, immediately post 9/11, one of the things that many people forget now, I think, is that there was a very real sense of unity globally in the world from people of lots of different backgrounds, politically, civilizationally, countries that previously had been, for example, at odds with the United States on many different fronts, responded to the event that happened in a way that showed in many ways great understanding of what the impact of that was on the USA. The USA, of course, being a country that has not in modern times known invasion, and so the deep trauma caused by something of that kind, I think, resonated throughout the world. What then happened in terms of developing, first of all, responding in Afghanistan, but in particular by then moving on to the so-called war on terror, which was based in the end on what I think by common consent now is clearly seen to have been a set of fabrications around the threats posed from Iraq militarily. Not to say that Iraq was in any way an ideal society, quite the contrary, under Saddam Hussein. But the response went into a different kind of mode, a different kind of asserting of military and civilizational power. And in that context, of course, a very big challenge to the possibilities of dialogue, because weaponry can sometimes seem to overcome the voices of dialogue.
Thank you very much. Just really drawing upon your 6 points. In the first point, you mentioned how one should learn from history. You mentioned the Black Lives Matter movement. Should we have not learned, within human nature, the place of racial equality? I mean, should we have not learned, during the abolishment of slavery? Is it not a repeated cycle of the same problem? And how can we learn from, hopefully now, at least with the issue?
I mean, in many ways, sadly, it is a repeated cycle. And at the time of, for example, the funeral of George Floyd, I looked back through things that I'd been engaged in my own lifetime. And I came across something that I'd written in 1984 called The Problems of the White Ethnic Majority. And I think, in the end, fundamentally, change in relation to these things come about when those who are in relative power in relation to others are prepared to self-examine. And that's a painful process. The thing that I read out from Salman Rushdie as a challenge to white people, it's a sharp thing that's being said there. It's not something that everybody can swallow or accept and will sometimes react against. But I think unless one takes that kind of challenge seriously, the chance of overcoming what lies behind it is very slim. I think also one does have to understand that in the end, many of these matters, though they may be informed by personal attitudes and personal prejudice, are not only rooted in that, they're also rooted in systemic and structural things. And so, for example, in our own country, in the United Kingdom, we have never really, I would argue, come to terms in a self-critical way, in a dialogical way, with our imperial and colonial past. We haven't dialogued properly with those who came out under that. And whereas, for example, in a country like Germany, in its historical assessment of the Nazi period, has tried, not always properly or fully, but has tried to engage with that history seriously and honestly and painfully. How far does really the colonial and imperial inheritance, for example, in the UK, how far is that taken seriously in school curricula? How far is that engaged with? How far do we have to face that? Or is it just an option?
Yeah. The place of these within the school curricula. Do you have any kind of alternative methods that you would suggest in tackling these, or would you say that having a place in school curricula is the main one, the key one?
I mean, I think sometimes one can try or put too much hope or expectation on education systems, and can say, well, everything would be better if we could better educate. But I think there is a very profound sense in which education systems are important, um, because they're partly to do with the shaping of minds and emotions and attitudes when people are young. Um, and they can take steps that perhaps can't be taken out of the context. So, to draw an example out of other enmities between people. So, for example, following the Second World War, one of the incredible things when one reflects on it that the French state and the German state did, having had, or the French state having experienced, French people having experienced brutal occupation during the Second World War, and the French and German people having had a history of warfare going back 100 years or more, was they decided through Adenauer, the Chancellor in Germany, and de Gaulle in France, they decided actually to work on a joint curriculum in the schools. Now, think about that, how serious and difficult a task that would be. So if one put that to another context in the world, what would a joint curriculum between Japan and China, for example, look like in relation to what happened around the Second World War? What would a joint curriculum between Greece and Turkey look like in relation to aspects of the history of those countries? And so I think education systems do offer opportunities, but it's a challenging opportunity again. You can't simply, writing a history, a common history, when there's been deep conflict and suffering, is not a straightforward or superficial task. But I think that one example, France and Germany, not perfect, but that one example shows that historically in our social and political world, not just in our personal worlds, it is possible to do something like that. But I think, in terms of the slavery, that's why, in terms of the inheritance of colonialism, one has to have that engagement and not just write history from one perspective.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just checking through the questions. We have an interesting one from Jonathan Sachs. No, I think it's a quote from Jonathan Sachs. Sachs says, if religion is not part of the solution, then it will certainly be part of the problem. What impact do you think the COVID-19 has brought on relations between members of the different religions and faith traditions? Do you think the faith leaders have done enough to improve the interreligious relations during this difficult time? This is a question.
Yeah. Of course, this may be different in different parts of the world, and I wouldn't want to claim that I could speak very easily to this question globally or in another continent or even in Europe as a whole. I can speak something to it, I think, in relation to the UK, where on the whole, I think my feeling and assessment is that actually there has been a positive engagement and support across different faiths in relation to common challenges. So, for example, I think when in the first kind of, in many ways, panic around COVID-19 occurred in the UK and the government started to take measures very quickly, some of the measures that were taken made it extremely difficult for people of some religious traditions who had particular practices associated with around dying and with burying the dead, and particularly when there was potentially the idea of not even having burials, let alone the question of who could attend or in what way they'd be carried out. And there was a coming together significantly in the UK between a number of Muslim leaders and Jewish leaders who had common concerns around rituals and such like, which the religious traditions normally wish, if at all possible, to practice. But also there was support for that from people in other religious traditions. So I think sometimes, and I think in this instance and in many other, at a much more concrete level, for example, in the provision of, for example, food to people who've been shielding at home and not being able to go out and buy food for themselves. Often on the local level, there's been very practical cooperation between, again, people from different faith communities, preparing and delivering food also in a religiously and culturally sensitive way, because of that shared understanding that those kind of things matter. They maybe matter differently across different traditions. So I think there has been, in many ways, a lot of positive engagement across traditions, a willingness sometimes to learn from different faith traditions. So as we come in the UK now to slowly the opening up, for example, of places of worship, I know the United Reformed Church, one of the Christian churches, produced some guidance on what they called like towards the new normal, and things to think about and reflect on and plan for. Now, I know that a number of different congregations and groups and temples and so on in different faith traditions, they've had to develop their own, but they've used some of the exemplar material from this particular Christian reflection and planning. So I think there's been, at a very practical level, those kinds of things. At a more profound level, in many ways, there's also been, I think, the sense that religious traditions do have of what's really important in life. And one of the things that COVID has brought about, on the one hand, a terrible challenge and terrible bereavements and illness, and sometimes recovery of that taking long time for people into the future, not knowing what that will mean, just the physical thing, before we even start talking about the economic impact. But nevertheless, I think for some there's been that opportunity for reflection on, well, what really is important in my life, in the way in which that might not have been there previously. Because when the world is stable, when everything you think it will be as it will be, and when you've lived in a privileged part of the world, as I have at least, where the norms and the structures and the institutions all appear to be there, this event has raised those kind of questions. And I think, again, in many ways across faiths, often there's been that sharing of a wider sense of what's important in life with the wider society.
And on to our final question now. It's a bit of a critical question.
Yeah.
If dialogue is a process that can be slow and cannot be imposed, what strategies should be taken, along with dialogue, to ensure that violence against the different does not occur during the process of transforming our understandings?
Okay. Can you read that one more time?
If dialogue is a process that can be slow and cannot be imposed, what strategies should be taken, along with dialogue, to ensure that violence against the different doesn't occur during the process of transforming our understandings?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, I think this speaks to the fact that I think both the challenge and the opportunity around dialogue is the importance of doing it or attempting it at different levels and in different ways concurrently, so that one can't simply rely on, if you like, interpersonal dialogue between individuals of goodwill to make progress with these issues in a wider conflictual context. One can't simply say, well, I'll get on with my neighbour or my workmate and then it'll all change. So it's important. And without that, one might just have, if you like, symbolic acts with religious leaders operating on a national or international level who come together. And that is important too, because sometimes it cuts through and it sends a clear message, more than sometimes things that are going on at ground level, or at least it challenges things. Sometimes big symbols can alter things profoundly. Again, to take an example out of kind of European history, when the Chancellor of Germany, Willy Brandt, went to his knees in the Warsaw Ghetto, that spoke symbolically much more to German-Polish reconciliation than a lot of words, or even than some diplomatic actions that might have been undertaken at the time. It had a profound symbolic impact. And I think, that can be the case at national or international levels. Acts of that kind can shift perceptions and open up new ways of looking at things and create new possibilities. But on their own, without something also at the ground level. So I think the challenge really is to try to work at dialogue on all levels and in all different spheres. So it includes the political, it includes the personal, it includes the civilizational, the cultural, and the religious. So if you leave out the personal, or you leave out the religious or cultural, or you leave out the political, it's unlikely that steady and balanced progress can be made. And one of those areas might then flare up more into a more conflictual mode. Of course, even this is very easy to say. It's much harder to do. But I think that's the challenge, to try to engage seriously with dialogue at all these levels concurrently.
Thank you very much, Professor. I think that's the end of the questions we've got. So thank you.
Thank you very much, those who've put the questions. I appreciate them.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing it together and ending on such a constructive note. I think with a lot of work for those engaging in dialogue. Thank you again for being here with us this evening. I hope this. I hope this discussion is just the beginning, and perhaps just a spark, a catalyst of something, the new era that we're going into. So thank you, Professor, for being with us again. And thank you to all our viewers for being here, continuing watching the discussion with us and contributing with your comments and questions. Please do subscribe to our YouTube channel. And I hope we all keep safe and stay well. And hopefully in the near future, we'll be able to be together, having these events in our classrooms and halls together. So
big thank you to the Dialogue Society on behalf of myself and all those who participated.
Thank you.